Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome back to Virtual VETS'20. This is part 17 of our 18-part webinar series hosted by the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. I'm Earl Morgan, the NVSBC Program Director, and to our new attendees, thank you for joining us today. Again, we'd like to thank the 8 sponsors who made this webinar series possible. The runtime for this webinar is 1 hour. During the webinar, if you have any questions, please type it in the text box on your screen. We'll try to get to all of your questions on this webinar, and if by chance we miss your question or don't have time to answer it, we'll get the answer to you and post it on the Virtual VETS'20 replay webpage. Now I'd like to introduce our Executive Director of the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, Mr. Scott Jensen.
Thanks, Earl. Thanks again for all the work you do for these virtual vets webinars, and appreciate the introduction. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone out there. It's great again to be here with you again on our Tuesday afternoon webinar series. And would like to point out we do have an anomaly next week. For those of you who are used to joining us on Tuesdays, we're actually running a webinar next week on Wednesday the 4th. So please mark your calendars and make that that note change. Today, we're joined with another great friend of MVSBC's and small business, Mr. Peter Ford, from our friends at Piero Mazza. Peter advises government contractors and commercial businesses on a broad range of procurement matters. He's adept at navigating issues related to eligibility for and participation in small business programs across a vast array of specialties and categories. He comes with an incredible resume and an incredible experience. As team lead for Piero Mazza's claims and appeals, he helps prime and subcontractors prepare, file, and if necessary, appeal REAs and claims to recoup time and or money lost performing on a contract. And Peter heads the firm's Boulder office out in Colorado, and he tells me he's sitting on 12 inches of snow right now with 2 small kids at home. So count your blessings if you're still looking at sunshine out there these days. But Peter, it's great to have you here today. We appreciate you taking the time with us. It's always great to hear from you, and I will turn it over to you and talk to you on the back end. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Earl. Of course, thanks for having me. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today to discuss other transaction authorities. As Scott, Earl mentioned, my name is Peter Ford. I'm a partner at Piero Mazza. We're a DC-based law firm, and like they said, I manage the firm's Boulder, Colorado office. Piero Mazza, I like to say, is a business law firm dedicated to servicing the needs of commercial businesses and state and federal contractors. We have several practice groups, including corporate, labor and employment, and litigation. But what we are most well known for is our government contracts group. And as government procurement lawyers, we're always looking out for the new rules, legislation, methods of procurement, etc., that could potentially benefit our clients, most of whom are small businesses like yourself. And OTAs, other transaction authorities, OTA is the acronym, they are a unique procurement method. However, as you will see, they're not new. I mean, they date back to the space race, but it's only in the last few years that they've really gained popularity. For a number of reasons that we'll discuss later on. Unfortunately, given the circumstances, I obviously can't poll the audience. I can't see hands to get a sense of who is familiar with OTAs, who's an expert, who's heard of the acronym OTA, but is clueless as to what it means, or if you're somewhat familiar. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. So think of this really as a one-on-one course on OTA. And as Scott mentioned, use the messaging tool if you have any questions. I'm going to save questions for the end of the webinar, and I will try to answer as many as I can, time permitting. Next slide, please. Next slide. One more. All right, thank you. So what is an OTA in the first place? What's the hype all about? Other transaction authority, and again, the acronym is OTA, is a dynamic instrument for utilizing commercial and emerging technology. An other transaction award, an OTA award, is an available government agency tool to do a number of things. One, it helps adopt and incorporate business practices used outside of the government, meaning the commercial industry. It helps leverage and broaden the industrial base available to the government, meaning more non-traditional companies. It encourages flexible, faster, less expensive production design and execution. And finally, it helps leverage commercial industry investment in the technology development by fostering new relationships. Like I said, OTAs are very popular, and they have been for the last few years. Before delving into the weeds of OTA, I did want to give you a little bit of history on how they came to be. Like I said, they started with NASA back in 1958 during the space race. And then over the last several decades, they've rolled out to different agencies: Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, and DOT. In all, there are now 11 executive agencies that have OTA authority. And then finally, DARPA, part of the DoD, was initially granted authority in 1988, 1999, but then it was expanded to all of DoD in 1991. And really, DoD is the most popular when it comes to OTAs and the most constant in terms of OTA funding and OTA obligations and OTA awards. So that's really what we're going to focus on today, is OTAs, but in the context of DoD. And that's not to say that OTAs in the context of other agencies are completely different. I mean, they're very similar. Each agency has their own guidelines for OTAs, but they all have the same general purpose, so to speak. You can go to the next slide, Earl. So who can award an OTA? This table provides a list of the 11 executive agencies that have OTA authority. The acronym, it's a little confusing because the acronym OTA often refers to both other transaction agreements and other transaction authority, which are two different things. Other transaction authority is the statutory authority of an agency to enter into an other transaction agreement, both of which are confusingly referred to as OTAs. Some of these do have sunset provisions. And what I mean by that is, yes, these are the agencies that are currently authorized to use OTAs, but some of them have sunset provisions. And what that means is that their authority, their OTA authority, shall cease to have effect after a specific date unless further congressional action is taken to extend the law. To give you an example, the Department of Homeland Security, that authority expired at one point at the end of fiscal year 2017, but that has since been renewed. And like I said, DoD is the most popular, the most constant. So this webinar is going to focus on DoD's authority. I mean, in that regard, there's actually a Bloomberg report which indicated that DoD's OTA spending in fiscal year 19 exceeded $7 billion. And if you think about that, it was at $4 billion for fiscal year 18 and roughly half of that for fiscal year 17. So as you can see, it's obviously steadily increasing. Next slide, please. Part of that increase is because the Pentagon is really pushing for the use of OTAs on R&D projects, research and development. The Pentagon issued a digital modernization strategy in July 2019, urging procurement officials to look at OTAs when they can. Why? In part because the Pentagon sees OTAs as a way of getting R&D projects done quickly. And we'll get to that in a bit. But generally speaking, the process can result in OTAs being awarded in a matter of weeks versus months, like a traditional procurement contract. So OTAs are really for R&D, so they're for basic, applied, and advanced research projects and prototype projects. In the 2016 NDAA, that expanded the definition of prototype projects and made DoD OTA authority permanent. And that's really driven the increase in spending in the last few years. Prototype projects under OTA are meant to be directly relevant to enhancing the mission and effectiveness of military personnel and the supporting platforms, systems, components, or materials proposed to be acquired or developed by DoD. And they must be directly relevant to improvements of platform systems, components, or materials and used by the armed forces. So you can see the references to supporting platforms, components, or materials, or the improvement of platform systems, components, or materials. Frankly, that's very broad. And for that reason, it does give the agencies, and DoD in particular, a lot of discretion in terms of utilizing OTA as a procurement method. That prototype project authority dollar thresholds, they were doubled in a 2018 NDAA, which again just shows the push to use OTAs by DoD. The DoD OTA guide describes 3 types of OTAs. There's research OTAs, prototype OTAs, and production OTAs. But the focus on this webinar is going to be on prototype and production OTAs. You can go to the next slide. So who can receive a prototype OTA award? For a prototype project under OTA, there are 4 conditions, at least one of which must be met in order for DoD to be able to use its OTA authority. This is the first condition, and that's that there must be at least one non-traditional defense contractor participating to a significant extent in the prototype project. I'll define significance in a couple of slides, but let's start off by what is a non-traditional defense contractor? Well, it's an entity that is not currently performing and has not for at least the 1-year period preceding the solicitation for the transaction performed any contract or subcontract for DoD that is subject to full coverage under cost accounting standards. What does that mean? Well, it's really meant to grab commercial companies operating out of Silicon Valley. DoD wants to grab non-traditional defense contractors who are pushing the boundaries on technology, but maybe are not interested in doing business with the federal government because of all the regulatory requirements that come along with it. Like, for instance, the cost accounting standards. Next slide. So these are the second and third conditions. And again, only one has to be met for DoD to have authority. The second condition is that all significant participants in the transaction are small businesses, and small businesses are defined by the Small Business Act or non-traditional defense contractors, which we just discussed. The third condition is that at least 1/3 of the total cost of the prototype project is to be paid out of funds provided by sources other than the US government. So OTAs, prototype OTAs are generally privately funded. And I'll get to that 1/3 rule in more detail shortly. Next slide, please. Fourth and finally, DoD can use its authority, its OTA authority, if the senior procurement executive for the agency determines that exceptional circumstances justify the use of transaction for innovative business arrangements or structures that would not be feasible or appropriate under a contract. And when I say contract, I mean a traditional procurement contract. And obviously that's a huge catch, assuming that none of the other conditions are met. So in this instance, we're not dealing with a non-traditional defense contractor. We're not dealing with a group of small businesses. We're not dealing with the project being developed at least 1/3 at potentially private expense. It's a catch-all. It's a catch-all for senior procurement executives to approve the use of OTA. And again, this is meant to capture the large contractors that are already doing business with the federal government. And just to illustrate really quickly, in 2018, Microsoft was one of the largest recipients of OTA obligations tied to a virtual reality program that they're rolling out with the Army. So it just goes to show you that Microsoft is a large federal contractor, and they're also a huge recipient of OTA obligations under this fourth condition, which again is the catch-all and which gives DoD a lot of discretion in saying that we do have OTA authority for this particular procurement. Next slide, please. I mentioned the word significant and significant participation either by small businesses or non-traditional defense contractors, and significant is meant to capture that the entity, i.e. the non-traditional defense contractor and or small business, is supplying a new key technology or product, accomplishing a significant amount of the effort, causing a material reduction in cost or schedule, or causing an increase in performance. But as you can see here, that there's really no definition of material, there's no definition of significant amount, meaning there's no numbers, for example, tied to any of these four conditions. Instead, they are broadly phrased, and they're broadly phrased for the reason to give DoD some discretion in how they can make these things happen. Real quickly, back to the 1/3 test. The general rule is that amounts counted for purposes of funds provided by sources other than the government do not include costs that were incurred before the date on which the OTA agreement becomes effective. Next slide. However, costs that were incurred for a prototype project by a party after the beginning of negotiations that ultimately result in an OTA agreement with respect to the project before the date on which the transaction becomes effective may be counted. So, for instance, if you start negotiations with DoD on an OTA, and as part of those negotiations, you start developing the prototype at your own private expense, and the associated costs reflect 1/3 of the total cost, then those would qualify for the 1/3 test. So the point is, these costs can be incurred even before entering the OTA agreement if you're in negotiations with DVD, provided that the official responsible for entering the OTA determines in writing that the party incurred the cost in anticipation of entering the OTA, and it was appropriate for the party to incur the cost before the OTA became effective in order to ensure successful implementation of the agreement. Next slide. Okay, so those are the 4 conditions, and assuming at least one of the 4 conditions are met, such that DoD has OTA authority for a prototype project, then what happens? Meaning, what happens after OTA prototyping? This is where production OTs really come into play. Innovative solutions, i.e. the prototype, can transition to production without further competition if the OTA award was originally competitively awarded, the participants in the original OT successfully completed the prototype project, advanced consideration was provided, and notice of the potential follow-on production OT was provided when completed. An important distinction between OTAs and traditional contracts is that an OTA is not technically a procurement contract. It has all the elements of an enforceable contract from a legal perspective, but it's not considered a procurement contract, meaning it's not subject to the FAR, it's not subject to the DFARS, and it's not subject to the Competition and Contracting Act, also known as CICA. However, Congress did mandate that to the maximum extent practicable, competitive procedures shall be used. So just notice that mandatory language shall be used. I mean, clearly Congress still wants some competition to happen to the extent possible, even though, again, these contracts are not subject to the Competition and Contracting Act. They're also not subject to other procurement statutes like the Procurement Integrity Act. Notably, however, fiscal law principles still apply to OTAs as it applies to all federal acquisitions. In DoD, these principles include the Anti-Deficiency Act, appropriation, authorization, the bona fide need rule, expiring, canceling funds, and pre-validation. Next slide. So how are OTAs similar to traditional procurement contracts? They're traditional, or they're similar in that competitive procedures are encouraged, and they're both in writing. Also, the participant, meaning the OTA awardee, has obligations to the government just like a traditional prime contractor does. And although OTAs are incredibly popular to consortia, which we'll discuss in a bit, entities entering OTAs can be a single company, a joint venture, a prime contractor with subcontractors, or a partnership. So why go the OTA route? What are the benefits of entering into an OTA? One of the big benefits is that standard intellectual property provisions and protections in a traditional contract do not have to be included in an OTA. But like a traditional contract, an OTA is subject to negotiation. So it's conceivable, and frankly, we've seen this, that DoD could assert rights, assert data rights in an OTA similar to what it would assert in a traditional contract. It's just not required to do so like it would in a traditional contract. Agencies also do not have to require that entities meet the cost accounting standards or use accounting systems that adhere to these standards. But again, similar to IP, that's something that DoD could put into the agreement. It's just not required. Minimal competition is an obvious benefit. And while competition is encouraged, it's not mandatory, and there's certainly nothing like a rule of tool analysis or a responsibility determination that must be performed. And frankly, if there's only one responsive entity on an OTA, that's it. I mean, they're going to get the prototype project and very likely the follow-on production contract. OTAs also present a faster procurement cycle, mostly because they're not subject to a lot of the SICA and Procurement Integrity Act issues. But I will say, yes, they are generally a faster way in terms of getting something done, meaning issuing and awarding a procurement, but that's not always the case. I mean, it can take weeks, but it could take months, just like a traditional procurement, and it could take longer. But generally speaking, it's faster. Lastly, there's very low risk of a protest. That's not to say that protests haven't happened. I mean, they have, but they are very rarely successful because the traditional protest arguments, meaning post-award protest arguments, for instance, in evaluation error, meaning you misevaluated me, the non-awardee, or you misevaluated the awardee, those don't come into play when it comes to OTAs. It really boils down to whether the agency, in this case DoD, acted within its its statutory authority in making the award. And this is what a GAO decision called Oracle was all about. The Oracle decision was decided in May of 2018. And in that decision, GAO held that it had jurisdiction to hear a protest challenging the Army's entry into an OTA with a company by the name of REAN, which was awarded as a follow-on production OTA for cloud migration and operation services with a not to exceed value of $950 million. GAO explained that because Oracle, the protester, argued the Army did not appropriately use its authority to award the production OTA to REAN, GAO had jurisdiction to review this limited protest issue. Eventually, GAO sustained Oracle's protest on two grounds. First, GAO found that a follow-on production contract or transaction may be awarded without the use of competitive procedures if the prototype OTA provided for award of a follow-on production contract to the participants in the transaction, and the Army acknowledged this did occur. So in the Oracle decision, the agency tried to rely on some language, not in an official procurement document, that said there might be a follow-on production OTA, but that wasn't sufficient. It had to be in the actual documentation themselves, meaning the OTA agreement for the prototype. It couldn't just be something that the agency said on the side, or something that they slipped in some other document that's not technically an agreement between the parties. GAO also noted that the applicable statute requires that participants successfully completed the prototype project provided for in the transaction, and REAN had not completed the entire prototype project described in the transaction document. So in essence, if you want a follow-on production contract, or you want to be awarded a follow-on production contract or be eligible for one, you first have to complete the prototype project in its entirety. And in Oracle, there were some modifications to the procurement documents that added some additional feature to the prototype, kind of at the last minute. And REAN tried to claim that they did everything that was required in the OTA agreement, but GAO noted that what you didn't complete was this modification component that was issued after the OTA agreement, and because you didn't do everything, the project wasn't technically completed, and therefore they're not entitled to award a follow-on project production OT to REAN. You go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the vast majority of OTA obligations go through consortia. So what are consortia? Consortia are groups of contractors, traditional, non-traditional contractors, meaning small businesses, research institutions, educational institutions, and they form this consortium together. Each participant retains its separate legal status, and the consortium's control over each participant is generally limited to activities involving the joint endeavor, particularly with respect to the division of profits. A consortium is formed by contract, which delineates the rights and obligations of each member. You can submit your membership application online, you sign a membership agreement, and you pay a fee. And then their managers, there could be one manager, there could be multiple. They issue calls for white papers and proposals from the individual consortium members. And then the government evaluates the responses and makes an award selection. So I like to. So, I mean, and if you can't, think of consortia a little bit like GSA's role in the Federal Supply Schedule program, in that GSA is kind of a gatekeeper in terms of who can get on the schedule and who can't. But then once you're on the schedule, you just go, meaning you go through eBuy and you find and pursue opportunities through the various procurement agencies. Next slide. And this slide and the next, this is just a sample list of some of the consortia. There's the Consortium for Command, Control, and Communications in Cyberspace, also known as C5, the System of Systems Consortium, and many others. I'm not going to bother you reading the entire list to you, or you can go to the next slide. But I mean, you can see that each one has a unique focus. For example, energy, ground vehicle systems, biomedical technology, etc. So I guess you may be asking, how do you know which one is right for you? Well, it's really just a matter of getting out there and finding the consortium that kind of fits either where you are now or where you want to go in the future with your business, and in particular your business with DoD. Next slide. So I pulled a sample consortium membership agreement to give you a sense of what you would see in one, and this is with System of Systems Consortium. As you can see, it's an annual membership fee of $500. There's a general membership meeting at least once a year. The board of directors governs all business affairs. Data rights would be as defined in the OTA. And again, going back to what I was saying before, is that they're not, the government doesn't have to insert data rights into the agreement, but they're subject to negotiation, and they very well can, but they're just not required to do so. It also addressed export controls, which you would see in a traditional prime contract flow down to subs, and it allowed for a voluntary withdrawal of membership with a 14 advance notice, and the term was for 5 years with automatic renewal. All right, well, now that we've discussed what an OTA is, and importantly, what an OTA is not, how does it actually work? What is an OTA procurement process like, and how does it differ from that of a non-traditional procurement? Unfortunately, I don't have a slide for this, but I thought it would be worth discussing anyways. So all OTA actions are tailored to the specific requirement. What does that mean? There's no one size fits all, but generally speaking, it begins by the agent. And again, this is, you'll see, this is similar to the procurement process for a traditional contract, but different, and we'll get to that in a second. So it begins by the agency posting what's called a request for solutions or a solutions, or request for white papers. Next, the agency evaluates solutions. The agency may elect to down select solutions and invite vendors to demonstrate solutions. And if they do, the agency evaluates down selected set of solutions. Once that step is completed, the agency enters into a statement of work collaboration with selected vendors. And then the agency's program attorney and vendors council negotiate data rights. And then finally, the agency or the consortium, if applicable, awards the OTA. And then I think we just touched on this before. I mean, if the OTA is awarded a prototype, a follow-on production OTA may be directly awarded to that same vendor if the solutions, the request for solutions specifically stated that a follow-on was anticipated after satisfactory completion of the prototype. So what is a request for solutions? This is an RFQ. It's an RFP. It's similar, but it's also very different. The government may request solutions to be submitted to the government team in a number of different formats other than traditional written presentation pitches, and even Shark Tank-like presentations. However, procurement terminology, FAR, DFARS, and the terms of art should not be used. And again, with the idea that we're not trying to reel in your traditional see these terms. And frankly, don't want to see the government jargon. And so the idea is that we shouldn't be using it if we want to actually get their attention and at the end of the day, get their innovative technology. They may be more open-ended than procurement RFPs simply because FAR 15 does not apply. And importantly, they focus on the problem, not a government prescribed solution. And it should use layman and industry terms, and again, not government jargon. The selected solicitation approach should be tailored to the value of the problem set. At most, the issue and request, most solutions state the issue and request that the solutions be discussed generally. So we're talking typically less than 10 pages. Finally, a little on new developments with OTA. As you can imagine, like everything, the COVID-19 pandemic has had significant impacts on OTA. More DoD acquisition officials are now authorized to award prototype OTAs without needing higher approval within DoD or notifying Congress. Specifically, prototype OTAs and follow-on production contracts, or OTAs, in excess of $100 million may now be approved by the directors of the defense agencies or field activities command officers of combatant commands with contracting authority and the director of the division innovation unit rather than an agency's senior procurement executive, which is generally what is required. Similarly, agreements valued in excess of $500 million typically require Secretary Ellen Lords or her fellow secretaries of notice to Congress. However, in light of the COVID-19 response and pursuant to it, these agreements may now be approved by an agency's senior procurement executive. So again, the idea is if there are certain solutions that are, let's again, coming out of Silicon Valley that could be used to fight the pandemic, and obviously the government wants access to them, and OTAs are generally already a fast way to get that type of technology. So this just provides for an even faster way for DoD to get at it and to utilize it. So really, that's all I have for you today. As a disclaimer, this is not meant to be legal advice. If you require legal guidance in any specific situation, you're encouraged to qualify or engage a qualified lawyer. But no, thank you very much, and please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions.
Peter, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate your time and expertise in a very, what can be oftentimes a very complex environment. We appreciate you breaking that down for us and explaining it to us. And as we always point out to our members, Peter sharing his contact information there. If you do have questions that occur after the end of the series here, please feel free to reach out to either us and we can get them to Peter, or to reach out to Peter directly with the contact information that you have. We don't have any follow-on questions at this point, so we will move on with the rest of our day. But again, we thank you so much for your time, Peter, and this is very enlightening, and we look forward to our next time we get to engage with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great rest of the day, everyone.